Imagine being told you don't belong in a room where your name is about to be called as the highest authority. The courtroom in downtown Chicago felt colder than it should have for a late spring morning. The kind of sterile chill that seeped through polished wood benches and settled into the silence between people who had learned not to speak unless spoken to. Fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, as if even they were tired of witnessing the same quiet injustices unfold day after day. And at the center of it all stood a man in uniform. Officer Daniel Brooks, his posture rigid, his presence loud in a space that was supposed to be governed by restraint, his voice cutting through the room before anything else could take shape. "Hey, you can't just walk in here like that," he said sharply, his eyes fixed on a woman who had just stepped through the side entrance, a woman who didn't look hurried, didn't look lost, didn't look like she was searching for permission. She simply walked, measured steps, calm breathing, her heels echoing softly against the tiled floor. Angela Carter didn't respond. Right away, not because she didn't hear him, but because she had heard tones like that before, tones that assumed, that reduced, that decided who belonged and who didn't before a single word was exchanged. And yet there was something different in the way she carried herself, something unshaken, something that didn't bend under the weight of a uniform or a raised voice. But Officer Brooks stepped closer, closing the distance with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. "I said stop right there," he added, louder this time, drawing a few glances from the scattered people seated in the gallery. A couple of attorneys paused mid-conversation. A clerk looked up briefly, then looked back down, because moments like this were uncomfortable, and discomfort was easier to ignore than confront. Angela finally stopped, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze, her expression unreadable, steady, not defiant, not submissive, just present, and for a brief second, something in that stillness seemed to disrupt the rhythm of the room. But Brooks pushed through it, mistaking silence for compliance. "This area is restricted," he said, gesturing vaguely as if the entire courtroom answered to him. "You need to step back and wait like everyone else." A faint murmur rippled through the benches, not loud enough to challenge him, just enough to acknowledge what was happening. And still, Angela didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she held a slim leather briefcase at her side, her fingers relaxed around the handle, her posture straight, her breathing even, as if she was standing in a place she knew intimately, not as a visitor, but as someone who understood every inch of it, every echo, every rule that was supposed to matter. And yet Brooks kept going, filling the silence with assumption. "You can't just walk in here thinking you belong," he said, his tone edged with something sharper now, something that carried beyond instruction and into judgment. And somewhere in the room, someone shifted in their seat. Another person glanced toward the front as if waiting for someone else to intervene, but no one did, because the system often waited for permission to correct itself, and permission rarely came on time. Angela's eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the quiet observers, the lowered gazes, the practiced indifference, and then back to him. And in that moment, there was no anger, no fear, just a quiet certainty, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, because it knew exactly when it would be heard. And as the seconds stretched just a little longer than they should have, the air in the courtroom began to shift, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like the pause before a gavel strikes, like the breath before a name is called. And still, Officer Brooks had no idea that the room he thought he controlled was already preparing to remind him otherwise. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which direction this moment would fall. And Officer Brooks, unaware of the shift building beneath the surface, took that silence as confirmation, a quiet signal that he was still in control, that his voice still carried the weight it always had. "I am not going to repeat myself," he said, slower now, each word deliberate, as though speaking to someone who needed to be corrected. "Step back and wait your turn." His hand gestured again, sharper this time, pointing toward the public seating area where a few people sat pretending not to watch, pretending not to hear, because it was easier that way, easier to let moments pass than to stand in them. But Angela Carter did not move. Not immediately. She remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. And in that stillness, there was something that did not match the situation, something that did not align with someone being dismissed or redirected. It was not resistance, not defiance. It was something quieter, something deeper, like certainty that did not require explanation. And, for the first time, there was a flicker, small but present, in the eyes of a clerk seated near the front, a hesitation, as if they were about to say something. But the words never came, swallowed by the same invisible pressure that kept everyone else silent. Brooks noticed the hesitation, but not its meaning. He noticed only that no one was stopping him, and so he stepped closer again, closing the space that did not belong to him. You people always think the rules do not apply, he added under his breath, just loud enough to carry, just quiet enough to avoid direct challenge, and a few heads turned away at that, not because they agreed, but because acknowledging it would require action, and action carried risk. Angela's fingers adjusted slightly on the handle of her briefcase, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but deliberate, controlled, like someone preparing not to react, but to proceed. Her eyes shifted past Brooks for a brief moment, toward the elevated bench at the front of the room, the place where decisions were made, where voices carried authority not because they were loud, but because they were recognized, and then back to him. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, without urgency, without apology. Are you finished? The question did not rise. It did not challenge. It simply existed, and for a second, that alone disrupted the rhythm Brooks had set, because it was not the response he expected, not the reaction he was used to, and that hesitation, that brief pause, was enough for the room to feel it, the shift growing just slightly stronger, like a current moving beneath still water. But Brooks recovered quickly, his expression tightening. Excuse me, he replied, his tone sharpening again. But now there was a trace of something else beneath it, something less certain, something that had not been there before. And still, Angela did not raise her voice, did not step back, did not explain herself. She simply held his gaze, steady, unwavering, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere beyond his understanding. And in the background, barely audible at first, there was movement near the side door, the faint sound of papers being adjusted, of a chair shifting, small details that would have gone unnoticed in any other moment, but now seemed to carry weight, because something was aligning, something was approaching, and though Brooks could not yet see it, could not yet hear it clearly, the room was beginning to respond, not to him, but to something else entirely, something that did not need to announce itself loudly to be known. And as that presence drew closer, the air changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough that those paying attention could feel it, the kind of shift that comes just before a name is spoken, just before authority reveals itself. And still, standing there, holding on to a moment he believed he controlled, Officer Brooks had no idea that he was already standing on the edge of losing it. The sound became clearer this time, not loud, not disruptive, but precise, like something practiced, something that carried meaning without needing volume. The subtle click of a door opening from the side hallway, followed by the soft shuffle of measured footsteps. And though most people in the room had trained themselves not to react too quickly, there was a shift now that could not be ignored. A few heads turned, a few backs straightened, and even the clerk who had hesitated earlier now looked up fully, eyes fixed toward the front as if recognizing something before it was announced. Angela Carter did not turn immediately. She did not rush. She did not acknowledge the movement behind her with urgency. Instead, she adjusted her stance slightly, one small step forward, not away from Officer Brooks, but past him, as though the space he occupied had already become irrelevant. And that subtle movement, that quiet decision to proceed, created a pause that Brooks did not understand. His hand lowering just slightly from where it had been gesturing, his voice catching for a fraction of a second before he spoke again. I asked you a question, he said, but the firmness was no longer as sharp as before. Because something in the room had begun to shift beyond his control, and when Angela finally moved, it was not in response to him. It was in alignment with something else entirely. She stepped forward, calm, unhurried, the sound of her heels steady against the floor, each step deliberate, each step carrying a weight that had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with certainty. And as she passed him, not brushing against him, not acknowledging him, simply moving beyond him, there was a brief moment where Brooks turned slightly, as if to stop her again. But the words did not come, not this time, because in that same moment, a voice rose from the front of the courtroom, clear, practiced, unmistakable. All rise. It was not loud, but it did not need to be. The authority in it was immediate, instinctive, and like a current passing through the room. Chairs shifted, people stood, conversations stopped mid-breath, and the air itself seemed to realign around that command. Brooks hesitated, just for a second, his body caught between the instinct to maintain control and the recognition that something larger had just taken precedence. And then the second line followed, measured, formal, final. Court is now in session. And in that moment, Angela had already reached the front, her path uninterrupted, her pace unchanged. She set her briefcase down with a quiet precision on the bench, her hands steady, her movements practiced in a way that did not draw attention but demanded recognition. And only then did she turn, not toward Brooks, not toward the gallery, but toward the room as a whole. And for the first time, the perspective shifted, because she was no longer standing among them. She was positioned above them, and the realization did not hit all at once. It moved in waves, starting with the clerk, then the attorneys, then the gallery. A collective understanding forming before it was spoken, before it was confirmed. Brooks stood still, his posture rigid, his mind catching up too slowly to what was already unfolding. And then the final words came, steady, unmistakable. Your Honor, Judge Angela Carter presiding. And the title settled into the room like something that had always belonged there, something that did not need to be proven because it was already true. And in that instant, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition, full of reversal, full of everything that had just shifted without a single raised voice. And Brooks, standing where he had been so certain just moments before, felt that shift not as a sound, not as a command, but as a realization, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to undo. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because the room itself had already said everything that mattered, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but heavy, layered with realization. And at the center of it all, now seated behind the bench, Judge Angela Carter did not rush to fill that silence. She did not raise her voice or demand attention, because she no longer needed to. The authority she carried did not come from volume. It came from position, from truth, from the undeniable shift that had just taken place. Her hands rested lightly on the surface in front of her, composed, controlled, as if this moment was not unexpected, but simply arriving exactly when it was supposed to. And below, Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing where he had been, though the ground beneath him no longer felt the same, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in certainty. His gaze fixed forward yet unfocused, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the assumption he had held just minutes earlier. The room moved before he did. Attorneys straightened their files. The clerk adjusted paperwork with renewed precision. Members of the gallery shifted in their seats with a subtle awareness that something irreversible had just occurred. And still, Brooks had not moved, had not spoken, because the moment demanded something he had not prepared for. Not control, not command, but recognition. And recognition is often the hardest thing to offer when it contradicts everything you believed was true. Judge Carter's eyes moved across the room, not searching, not questioning, simply observing, taking in each detail with a calm that did not waver. And when her gaze reached Brooks, it did not linger longer than necessary. But it was enough to acknowledge, enough to confirm that she had seen everything that had happened before she took her seat, everything that had been said, everything that had been assumed. And yet, she did not address it directly, not yet, because timing mattered. And the courtroom, like justice itself, followed an order that could not be rushed. You may be seated, she said, her voice steady, even, carrying across the room without force. And as people sat, almost in unison, the sound of movement was soft, controlled, respectful, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the space earlier. Brooks lowered himself a second later than the others, the delay small but noticeable, as if his body needed an extra moment to adjust to the new reality, his hands resting at his sides, no longer gesturing, no longer directing. And in that stillness, the shift became complete. The transformation from authority to observer, from control to accountability. Though no accusation had been spoken, no confrontation declared, the weight of the moment did not need to be explained. It was understood. It settled into the room like something permanent, something that would not be undone by explanation or excuse. Judge Carter opened the file in front of her movements precise, deliberate, the pages turning softly as she reviewed the case at hand. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though the earlier interaction might remain unspoken, absorbed into the routine of proceedings. But then she paused, just slightly, her hand resting on the paper as her eyes lifted again, not sharply, not dramatically, but with intention. And when she spoke, it was not to call out, not to embarrass, not to retaliate. It was to establish something far more enduring. "Before we begin," she said, her voice calm, measured, "this courtroom operates on respect, not assumption." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that extended beyond the present moment, beyond the individuals involved. They defined the space. They redefined it. And though she did not name him, did not look directly at him again, there was no doubt where the message was meant to land. Brooks felt it, not as a command, but as a realization, one that settled deeper than any order ever had, because it did not demand obedience. It demanded understanding, and understanding, once reached, does not leave the same way it came. It stays, it lingers, it reshapes what comes next. And as the courtroom moved forward, as the clerk began to read the case, as the rhythm of proceedings resumed, there was something different now, something quieter but stronger, a recalibrated sense of what authority truly meant. And somewhere within that shift, a lesson had already been delivered, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the simple, undeniable presence of truth revealed at exactly the right moment. The courtroom settled into its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. Something subtle had changed, something that could not be measured in sound or movement, but could be felt in the way people held themselves, in the way eyes no longer drifted carelessly, in the way silence now carried awareness instead of avoidance. And at the center of it all, Judge Angela Carter continued, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, her voice steady as she reviewed the docket, her tone even as she addressed the attorneys, every word precise, every pause intentional, because true authority did not need to prove itself. It simply existed. And yet beneath that calm surface, the earlier moment had not disappeared. It lingered, not as tension, but as a quiet recalibration of everything that had just taken place. Officer Daniel Brooks stood along the side wall now, no longer at the center, no longer directing the flow of the room. His hands still, his posture composed but different, as if the certainty he had carried before had been replaced with something heavier, something that required him to think rather than react. And though no one openly acknowledged what had happened, there was an unspoken understanding that the room had witnessed more than just a procedural start to a hearing. It had witnessed a shift in perspective, a correction that did not come from confrontation, but from truth revealing itself at the exact moment it was needed. Judge Carter turned a page in the file. Before her, the soft sound echoing lightly in the quiet space. And for a brief moment her gaze lifted again, not searching, not challenging, but aware. And when her eyes passed over Brooks once more, there was no anger there, no trace of resentment, only recognition, the kind that sees clearly without needing to speak. And that alone carried more weight than any direct reprimand ever could, because it left no room for denial, no space for misunderstanding. It simply existed as fact, and Brooks felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that settles slowly, the kind that cannot be undone once it is understood. His shoulders adjusted slightly, a small shift, almost unnoticeable, but meaningful, as if his body was aligning with something new, something that did not rely on assumption but on awareness. And as the proceedings continued, the attorneys presented their arguments, their voices measured, their words structured within the boundaries of the court. But even in their delivery there was a difference, a heightened sense of attentiveness, as though everyone present had been reminded, in a way that required no announcement, that this space demanded more than routine. It demanded respect in its truest form, not the kind enforced by position, but the kind revealed through conduct. And as minutes passed, The earlier moment did not fade. It integrated itself into the atmosphere, shaping the way each interaction unfolded, shaping the way each word was spoken. And in that integration, something deeper took hold, a realization that extended beyond the individuals involved, beyond the immediate situation, into something broader, something that spoke to how easily perception can be mistaken for truth, and how quickly that illusion can be corrected when reality steps forward without hesitation. Judge Carter closed the file gently after reviewing the initial statements, her hands resting once more on the bench, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm authority as before, but now there was an added layer, something that resonated just a little deeper. "Proceed," she said, and the word was simple, almost routine, yet it carried with it the weight of everything that had already occurred, everything that had been seen, everything that had been understood without needing to be repeated. And as the case moved forward, as the structure of the courtroom reasserted itself, there was no need to revisit the earlier exchange, no need to call it out or define it, because its impact had already been realized. It had already done what it needed to do. It had shifted a perspective, corrected a moment, and reminded everyone present that authority, when grounded in truth, does not need to raise its voice to be heard. And standing there, no longer at the center but still within the space, Officer Brooks remained silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time, he understood that silence, when filled with awareness, could speak louder than anything he had said before. Time moved forward, but the weight of what had already happened did not disappear. It settled into the structure of the room, shaping the way each voice entered the space, shaping the way each person chose their words. And as the proceedings continued, it became clear that this was no longer just another routine hearing. This was a room that had been reminded of something it had almost forgotten, something that could not be written into policy or enforced by procedure, but something that lived in the space between people, in the way they saw each other, in the way they chose to speak or remain silent. And Judge Angela Carter remained at the center of that balance, not as a figure demanding control, but as a presence that defined it without effort, her attention moving between the attorneys as they presented their arguments, her questions precise, her tone measured, guiding the flow of the case with a calm authority that did not waver. And yet, even as she focused on the matter at hand, there was an awareness that extended beyond the legal discussion, an awareness of the room itself, of the shift that had taken place, of the lesson that had already been delivered without needing to be repeated. And along the sidewall, Officer Daniel Brooks stood still, but not in the same way he had stood before. There was no tension in his stance now, no need to assert, no need to correct, only a quiet presence, observant, reflective. And though he had not spoken since the moment everything changed, his silence was no longer empty. It was filled with something new, something that had taken root in the space between realization and understanding. His eyes followed the proceedings, but not with the same detached confidence he once carried. Now there was attention, genuine attention, as if he was seeing the room not as a place to control, but as a place to learn from. And that shift, though invisible to most, was significant, because it marked the beginning of something that could not be undone, the kind of change that does not announce itself, but reveals itself through behavior, through the absence of what once was. And as the case unfolded, a witness was called forward, their voice steady but cautious, answering questions under the structured rhythm of the court. And Judge Carter listened, fully present, giving space where it was needed, guiding when it was necessary, her role clear, her purpose grounded. And in that moment, the courtroom reflected what it was always meant to be, a place where truth was given the space to exist without distortion, without assumption. And that clarity, that restoration, carried weight far beyond the individual case being heard, because it reminded everyone present that the system, when functioning as it should, does not rely on who speaks the loudest, but on who listens the most carefully. And Brooks felt that, not as instruction, but as understanding, a quiet shift in perspective that did not come from being told, but from witnessing, from standing in a moment where everything he thought he knew had been challenged without confrontation, corrected without force, and replaced with something more grounded, more real. And as the hearing progressed, there was a subtle moment, almost easy to miss. where one of the attorneys addressed the court with a tone that carried hesitation, a brief uncertainty in their words, and, before it could grow, Judge Carter responded, not with correction, but with clarity, a single sentence that guided the direction without diminishing the speaker. And that was where the difference became undeniable. Authority was not about overpowering. It was about aligning, about bringing structure without stripping dignity. And that realization extended beyond the bench, beyond the attorneys. It reached the walls, the gallery, and the man standing quietly at the side. Because for the first time, Brooks was not measuring the room by how much control he had over it, but by how much respect it required to function as it should. And in that realization, something settled, something that did not need to be spoken aloud, something that would remain long after this day ended, long after the case was closed. Because some lessons are not taught through instruction, they are experienced, they are felt, and once felt, they do not fade. They become part of how a person moves forward, part of how they choose their actions, part of how they understand the spaces they walk into. And as the courtroom continued, steady, focused, aligned, there was no need to revisit what had happened earlier, because its impact was already woven into the present, shaping it, guiding it, ensuring that what came next would not be the same as what came before. There was a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when the courtroom no longer felt like a place recovering from tension, but a place transformed by it, as if the earlier shift had not only corrected a single interaction, but had quietly rewritten the atmosphere itself. And as the proceedings continued, that transformation became more visible in the smallest details, in the way voices softened before entering the space, in the way pauses were respected instead of filled, in the way attention was given without being demanded. And at the center of it all, Judge Angela Carter remained, composed, her presence steady, her focus unwavering as she listened to the final statements of the current matter, her eyes moving between speakers with intention, never rushing, never dismissing. And when she spoke, it was not to dominate but to clarify, each word carrying precision without pressure, the kind of authority that did not need to remind anyone that it existed because it was already understood. And along the side of the room, Officer Daniel Brooks remained still, but the stillness now held a different meaning. It was no longer the stillness of control waiting to act. It was the stillness of awareness, of reflection, of someone standing within a moment that had reshaped something deeper than surface behavior, his gaze no longer scanning the room for compliance, but resting on the proceedings themselves, absorbing, processing. And for the first time, there was no urgency in him to intervene, no impulse to direct, only a quiet presence that acknowledged the space for what it truly was. And as the final exchange between the attorneys concluded, there was a brief pause, not empty, but complete, the kind of pause that signals closure, and Judge Carter allowed it to settle, just for a second longer than expected, as if giving the room a chance to recognize that something had reached its natural end. And then she spoke, her voice calm, measured. The court will take a brief recess, and with that, the structured rhythm of the hearing released its hold, chairs shifted, papers gathered, voices returned, but softer now, more measured, as if the room itself had learned something about how it should sound. And as people began to move, to step out into the hallway or lean toward one another in quiet conversation, Brooks remained where he was for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but because something in him was not ready to leave just yet. Something in him understood that walking away too quickly would mean leaving behind the clarity he had just gained. And so he stood, taking in the space one more time, the bench, the gallery, the quiet order that now defined it. And then, slowly, he stepped forward, not toward the center, not toward control, but toward understanding, his movement unhurried, his posture steady. And as he approached the front of the room, there was no announcement, no audience, no need for attention, just a quiet acknowledgement of where he now stood. And for a brief moment, his eyes lifted toward the bench where Judge Carter remained, reviewing a document with the same calm focus as before. And though she did not look up immediately, did not acknowledge him right away, there was no dismissal in that, no distance, only the continuation of her role, grounded, consistent. And when her gaze finally rose, it met his not with judgment, not with triumph, but with something far more steady, recognition, the same kind she had offered before. the kind that sees without needing to speak. And in that exchange, brief and silent, something settled completely, not as an ending, but as a beginning, the beginning of a shift that would carry forward beyond this room, beyond this day. Because moments like this do not stay where they happen. They move with the people who experience them. They shape the way they enter the next room, the next interaction, the next decision. And as Brooks lowered his gaze, slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, there was no need for words, no need for explanation, because the lesson had already been understood, not through correction, not through force, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of truth revealed at exactly the moment it was needed. The hallway outside the courtroom carried a different kind of noise, not loud, not chaotic, but layered with low voices, quiet footsteps, and the subtle release of tension that had been held too long. And as people filtered out during the recess, conversations began to form in hushed tones, not about the case itself, but about what they had just witnessed, because moments like that did not pass unnoticed, they lingered. They followed people into the spaces between proceedings and inside the courtroom. The air remained still, almost untouched by the movement beyond its doors. Judge Angela Carter remained seated behind the bench, her focus returning to the documents in front of her, her posture unchanged, her presence steady as if the shift that had altered the room had not altered her at all, because for her, it had not been a disruption. It had simply been a correction, something that aligned the room with what it was always meant to be. And a few feet away, Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the front, not in the same position he had taken earlier, but closer now, not out of authority, but out of intention, his hands resting calmly at his sides, his gaze no longer searching for control but fixed with a quiet clarity, as if he understood that this moment, this space, required something different from him now, something he had not brought into the room before. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself had already carried the meaning. And then, Brooks took a small step forward, measured, respectful, stopping at a distance that did not intrude, did not assume, just enough to be acknowledged. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not forced, not rehearsed, but real. "Your Honor," he said, the words steady but carrying weight, because this time, they were not just a title, they were an understanding, a recognition that had not been there earlier. And though the phrase itself was simple, it marked a shift that could not be undone. And Judge Carter looked up, her eyes meeting his with the same calm presence as before, not surprised, not expectant, just aware, and she allowed a brief pause to settle between them, giving space for what had just been said to exist fully before responding. And when she spoke, her voice remained even, composed. "Yes, officer," she replied, not with distance, not with coldness, but with a tone that acknowledged the moment without elevating it beyond what it was. A step toward understanding, and Brooks nodded slightly, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it was not about correcting the past, it was about recognizing it, about choosing to move forward differently. And for a moment, it seemed as though he might say more, as though there were words forming that could attempt to explain, to justify, or even to apologize. But instead, he stopped, because something in him understood that not every realization needs to be spoken to be real. Some are better carried forward through action, through change that is shown rather than declared. And in that restraint, there was a kind of respect that had not been present before, not enforced, not expected, but chosen. And Judge Carter acknowledged that without needing to say it, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if to affirm that the moment had been understood, and that was enough. And as Brooks stepped back slightly, returning to his place with a quiet composure, the space between them no longer held tension, it held clarity, the kind that does not demand attention but reshapes it. And outside, the sounds of the hallway continued, the low hum of voices, the distant movement of people preparing to return, and inside, the courtroom remained grounded, steady, aligned with something that went beyond procedure, something that had been restored, not through confrontation, but through recognition. And as the seconds passed, the weight of the moment settled into something lasting, something that would not fade with the end of the day, because what had happened here was not just a correction of behavior, It was a shift in perspective, a reminder that authority, when truly understood, is not something you impose on others. It is something you learn to recognize. And once recognized, it changes the way you see everything that follows. When the courtroom doors opened again and people began to return, there was a noticeable difference in how they re-entered the space, not in their pace, not in their posture, but in their awareness, as if something unspoken had followed them into the hallway and quietly settled into their understanding before they stepped back inside. Voices remained low, movements more deliberate, and even the smallest gestures carried a sense of respect that had not been as present before. And at the front of the room, Judge Angela Carter remained exactly where she had been, composed, grounded, her presence unchanged by the shift around her, because for her, this was not a transformation. It was simply the standard restored, the balance returned to where it had always belonged. And as she prepared to resume the session, her hands resting calmly on the bench, her gaze steady across the room, there was no need for emphasis, no need for declaration. The authority was already understood, and along the side wall, Officer Daniel Brooks stood in quiet readiness, but not the kind of readiness that seeks control, rather the kind that reflects awareness, his posture aligned with the space rather than attempting to shape it, his presence no longer imposing but integrated. And when the clerk called the room back to order, the familiar words carried a deeper resonance this time. All rise. And as everyone stood, the movement was unified, not just in action, but in intention, a shared understanding of what the moment required. And when they sat again, the room felt complete, aligned, as if something that had once been slightly off had been corrected without disruption, without force, simply by truth taking its place. And as the proceedings resumed, Judge Carter spoke with the same calm precision as before, guiding the case forward. But now every word seemed to settle more firmly, not because it was louder, but because it was received differently, understood more fully, and throughout it all, Brooks remained still, attentive, his silence no longer uncertain but intentional, a choice rather than a reaction. And in that choice, there was growth, the kind that does not need to be announced to be real. And as the hearing moved toward its conclusion, the rhythm of the courtroom remained steady, consistent, shaped by the clarity that had been established earlier. And when Judge Carter delivered her final remarks on the matter, her voice carried not just authority, but balance, the kind that ensures every word lands exactly where it should. And when the gavel finally came down, not loudly, but with quiet finality, it marked more than the end of a case. It marked the completion of something deeper, something that had unfolded without spectacle, without confrontation, but with undeniable impact. And as people began to gather their belongings, to step out once more into the world beyond the courtroom, they carried with them more than just the outcome of the hearing. They carried the memory of a moment where perception had been corrected, where assumption had been replaced with truth, and where authority had revealed itself not through force, but through presence. And Brooks remained for just a second longer after the room began to clear, his gaze briefly lifting toward the bench, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. And then he turned, stepping forward into the hallway with a different awareness than the one he had brought in that morning. Because some lessons are not written into reports, they are not spoken into records, they are experienced in silence, carried forward in the way a person chooses to act when no one is watching. And as the courtroom doors closed behind him, the space inside remained steady, unchanged, holding its quiet truth, a truth that did not need to be repeated to be remembered, because once it is seen, it stays, shaping every moment that follows, long after the room has emptied and the voices have faded.